On the 8th day of the freeze, Captain Elias Voss rode south from Fort Huachuca alone. He had not told anyone where he was going, which meant he expected to find something shameful, or something dead. 14 miles of hardpan road in a January that had already killed more livestock across the San Pedro Valley than any winter in living memory. And he was riding toward a 60-acre homestead belonging to a man the valley had spent 4 months calling a fool. The horse beneath him moved carefully, hooves clicking on patches of gray ice that lay across the road like cracked glass. Voss's breath rose and dissolved. The valley floor stretched west and east in a stillness that felt less like quiet and more like aftermath, the way a room feels when the argument that filled it has finally gone silent. He was not riding out of concern. He told himself that clearly, each time a new thought crowded it aside. He was riding out because on the previous evening, a ranch hand named Colvin had come into the fort, saying that 2 of Harmon Raid's horses had died standing in their corral, that Reed himself had burns on both hands from a fire he'd been tending in the open air all night trying to keep his remaining stock alive, and that nobody across the lower valley had seen a light from the Silvermane place in 3 days. Voss had listened to all of that, and then, after a long pause, had poured himself a second cup of coffee and gone to bed. In the morning, he saddled his own horse instead of sending a rider. He would not have admitted, even to himself, that the reason was guilt. Some debts announced themselves plainly, and some arrived the way that Freeze had arrived, quietly through the bottom of the season, until the damage is already done. The story of Griffin Silvermane and the San Pedro Valley began not in January of 1892, but in the spring of the year before, when a man nobody in the valley quite knew how to read rode in from the east on a gray roan horse and filed on 60 acres of dry creek bottomland that most of the established ranchers would not have bothered to water their horses on. He was 31 years old. He stood a flat 6 feet, lean as wire with dark skin from his Apache mother's people, and pale gray eyes from a father who had left the picture before Griffin had a clear memory of him. He had spent 11 years as a contracted tracker and scout for the Army, first out of Fort Apache and then at Fort Huachuca, and he had in that time become the kind of man who was useful in direct proportion to how thoroughly everyone around him underestimated him. He read terrain the way some men read a newspaper, quickly and with retention. He knew which canyon walls held cold air through May and which ones released it by March. He knew, from his mother's people, why the old wickiup camps were never built in the prettiest meadows, but always on the leeward side of a particular grade, their backs to stone, their low open faces catching the residual warmth that the earth gave off in the deepest part of winter. He had trusted the Army twice. The first time, he had reported to his supervising lieutenant that a proposed patrol route crossed a stretch of canyon that flooded without warning from snowmelt runoff, even in weeks with no recent rain. The lieutenant had filed the report, and the patrol had taken the route anyway. 3 men came back without their horses, and 1 came back on a litter. The lieutenant received no reprimand. Griffin received a notation in his service record that described him as prone to overestimating risk in familiar terrain. The second time, Griffin had warned Captain Voss directly that the section of the San Simon Valley slated for a supply relay station sat in a natural cold sink, a geographic hollow where frost settled and lingered well past the date the Army's standard tables said was safe. Voss had listened, nodded, asked 2 or 3 precise questions that suggested he understood the concern, and then had approved the station placement unchanged. The relay station lost 17 mules to a late freeze that April. Voss submitted a damage report blaming unseasonal weather. Griffin was discharged the following week. The paperwork cited reduction in scouting requirements. He had ridden west with drum and $60, and the kind of quiet that a man settles into when he has decided to stop arguing with the world and simply outlast it. The 60 acres he filed on were not chosen carelessly. The valley settlers who rode past and glanced at his claim saw dry creek gravel and caliche soil and wondered what he was thinking. What Griffin saw was a south-facing slope behind the creek bed, a rock shelf at 14 feet that would serve as the base wall of anything he dug into the hillside, and a particular angle of grade that matched, almost exactly, the angles his mother's people had used for generations when they built for cold. He had spent 3 years watching how those shelters held temperature, while adobe walls nearby cracked and bled warmth into the air. He had spent 3 more noticing which army buildings stayed passably warm, and which ones drained fuel and men in equal proportion. He paid $12 to file the claim and set up a canvas lean-to and began digging the first week of June 1891. What he was building from the outside looked like nothing the valley recognized. He dug a main cellar chamber 14 feet into the south-facing slope, shoring the walls with flat sandstone laid without mortar in the Apache drystone method, each course slightly inward, so the weight of the hill pressed the walls together rather than apart. Above the cellar's mouth, he built a low brush and earth berm, packed and shaped to deflect wind over the opening rather than into it. He left a narrow slot at ground level on the south face, angled to catch the low winter sun while blocking the wind that came predominantly from the northwest. The entrance passage ran not straight in but at a dogleg, a short right-angle turn that broke the line of any cold draft before it reached the interior. Along the back wall, he set 6 large flat stones that had been sitting in the sun since June, stones that would absorb heat through the summer and release it slowly through the winter the way a banked fire gives off warmth long after the flames are gone. He dug a second, smaller chamber off the main one, with a low connecting passage just wide enough for a man walking bent at the waist. This second chamber was for Drum and his other 2 animals, a pair of desert-hardy goats he had acquired in July. The floor he lined with packed sand over a layer of dry grass, changed regularly, which held ground warmth from below while the stone walls held it from the sides. The brush shelter above ground, where Griffin himself would sleep in mild weather, was built on poles set at a specific angle, the poles leaning away from the northwest at precisely the pitch he had watched Apache camp builders use, so that wind pressure would seat the poles more firmly rather than tipping them. He wove dry ocotillo ribs and dead brush between the poles in the old layered method, each layer angled like scales, so rain shed outward and wind had no flat surface to push against. The neighbors noticed. They could hardly fail to. Ira Colvin, who ran a small horse operation 3 miles north, and who was the kind of man who liked to be the first to tell a joke before anyone else could tell it, rode past in late July and looked for a long minute at the bermed earthwork and the brush framework going up, and then said, loud enough for his hired man to hear, "I've seen prairie dogs do better." He told the story at the trading post in Benson that same week, and it got a laugh, and that made it the kind of story that gets told again. By September, the structure was largely complete, and Griffin had turned his attention to fencing a small pasture and cutting the dry grass along the creek for winter fodder. He kept to himself in the methodical way of a man who has chosen his direction and does not require anyone else's opinion of it. It was in October that Dale Pruitt named the thing. Pruitt worked at the Fort Huachuca Remount Station as a civilian farrier and occasional contractor, a broad, red-faced man of 45 who had opinions on everything within his sight and a talent for finding the phrase that would make a room laugh. He was not a cruel man in any particular way. He was simply a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything in his community's memory, and that kind of record accumulates a particular variety of confidence. He came into the Benson trading post one afternoon when 6 or 7 valley men were already inside, and someone mentioned that Griffin Silvermane had spent the summer digging into a hillside like an animal. Pruitt set his coffee tin down on the counter and said, without breaking stride, "Oh, you mean the Apache rabbit hole." The room laughed. The name fit the way mean names always fit, snugly enough to stick. By the following week it had traveled to 3 homesteads and back again, and when men spoke of Griffin's 60 acres, they called it the rabbit hole, or sometimes just called Griffin himself the rabbit, which they said with the particular smile of a man repeating something he considers already settled. Griffin heard it the first time from a boy of about 12 who was driving a buckboard past his fence line, and shouted it across the road without apparent malice, as children repeat what they have overheard at table. Griffin looked at the boy for a moment, the way a man looks at weather moving in from the west, estimating its weight and direction, and then went back to stretching wire. He had lived too long in 2 worlds to be surprised by the way each one found its own vocabulary for anything it could not categorize. The second time the name was used in Griffin's hearing was at the public muster at Benson in late October, when the valley's ranchers and homesteaders gathered to discuss the fall cattle drive schedule and hear a brief address from Captain Voss, who had ridden down from the fort on official business. Pruitt was there, standing at the edge of the group where his voice carried, and when Voss made a passing reference to the newcomers on the lower valley parcels, Pruitt said, "Even got a half-blood Apache out there, Voss. Spent his whole summer building himself an Apache rabbit hole. You remember him? Silvermane." There was laughter, a general, easy sound, the kind a crowd makes when it is comfortable and no one is going to push back. Voss looked briefly across the group and said nothing. He had recognized the name and looked away, and what passed through him in that moment was not guilt, but its quieter cousin, the faint awareness that a thing requires attention. Griffin was not at the muster. He was 14 miles south, finishing the insulation of the animal chamber with a second layer of dry grass pressed into the wall gaps. His sister Lena arrived at the end of October, driving a rented buckboard from Tombstone where she did laundry work and occasional seamstress jobs for the town's steadier residents. She was 26, small and dark like their mother, and she carried a quality of directness that had always coexisted uneasily with affection. She looked at the homestead for a long time before she climbed down from the buckboard. She walked to the berm above the main cellar entrance and stood there, looking at the low earth mound and the brush framework and the narrow south-facing slot. And then she turned around and looked at Griffin. "They're calling it the Apache rabbit hole," she said. "I know it," Griffin said. She was quiet for a moment. A wind came off the northwest ridge, low and cold, the first real cold of the season, and it moved through the valley with a sound like paper being torn slowly. "Is this what you mean to live in?" she said. It was not quite a question. "Through winter," he said. "Come inside." She bent and went through the dogleg passage and stood upright in the main chamber, and Griffin lit a single lantern on the flat shelf he had cut into the south wall. The chamber was perhaps 12 feet across and 8 feet from floor to ceiling at the highest point. The stone walls were dry, and the temperature inside, even in late October with no fire lit, was noticeably warmer than the air outside, the way a root cellar surprises you in June when you first open the door. Lena put her hand flat against the back wall, against the smooth face of one of the big stored heat stones, and held it there. "They're warm," she said. "They've been sitting in sun since June," Griffin said. She left her hand on the stone for another moment. The lantern threw their 2 shadows large and uneven across the dry stacked walls. She looked at her brother for a long time with the particular expression of a person who is revising something they thought they had already settled. "Griffin," she said more quietly, "what happens if it does not work?" He looked at the wall rather than at her. "Then I will have been wrong," he said. "That has happened before." She left the following morning and drove back towards Tombstone in a thin rain, and Griffin watched the buckboard go from the top of the berm and then went back down into the animal chamber to check the grass lining against the coming cold. The first sign came in early November, and it came in the language that Griffin had spent 11 years learning to read. The cloud color was wrong, not the pewter gray of an ordinary winter front, but something more olive-tinted, coming out of the north with a peculiar flatness at the base, the kind of sky that comes before a sustained cold front rather than a passing storm. The morning temperature on November 8th was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Griffin noted it. He also noted that the creek had dropped 2 inches overnight, which meant the ground upstream was freezing at depth, and that the quail on the south slope were bunched and still rather than feeding, which wasn't a behavior they showed for ordinary cold. He brought Drum and the 2 goats into the animal chamber that afternoon and packed an additional foot of dry grass along the north-facing wall. He moved 4 more flat stones from the sunny upper slope into the main chamber to add to the thermal mass. He cut 3 additional bundles of brush and pressed them into the windbreak berm above the entrance. He did these things without urgency, the way a careful man closes the shutters before a rain rather than during it. Across the valley, the signs registered differently, which is to say they mostly did not register at all. Harmon Reed, who ran the largest cattle operation on the valley floor, had seen warm Novembers and cold ones, and this November had not distinguished itself by the 13th. Colvin was focused on getting his last 3 horses shod before the Benson market. At the fort, the weather tables from the Army's meteorological reports for the region showed average projected lows for January at 22 degrees Fahrenheit, which was cold but not exceptional, and so nothing was done differently. On the 14th of November, Griffin's small patch of kitchen garden froze overnight, 6 weeks earlier than most years. He noted that, too. December passed in installments of ordinary cold, cold enough to be uncomfortable, but not enough to be serious, and a few of the valley men who had been watching Griffin's strange earthwork with amusement began to do so with something closer to curiosity, though none of them said so. The days were short and dry, and the mountain ridges to the east held snow from the middle of the month onward, which was not unusual, but was heavier than most years, and the creosote along the lower valley floor took on the flattened inward look that desert plants take when they are preparing for something. On the 4th of January, 1892, the temperature at dawn was 19 degrees Fahrenheit. That was the beginning. What followed was not a storm in the theatrical sense. There was no blizzard, no howling wall of snow sweeping down a mountain pass. What arrived was colder and slower, and in some ways harder to survive for its very quietness. A sustained ice-forming freeze that settled into the San Pedro Valley and did not leave. The temperature that first morning reached a high of 27 degrees and fell to 14 by nightfall. The second morning came in at 11 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest reading anyone in the valley had recorded, and stayed there for most of the day. Ice formed along the creek in sheets. The standing water in stock troughs went solid overnight. The adobe walls of the valley's houses, which were excellent at shedding summer heat but had no memory of cold, began to conduct it inward, so that inside surfaces grew damp and then cold to the touch, and the fires inside had to run continuously to keep a living temperature. The fuel problem arrived by the 3rd day. Wood was not plentiful in the lower valley under the best of conditions, and what most families had stocked against a normal winter wasn't sized for a continuous burn. Colvin's family, who ran 3 fires in their adobe house, had burned through their primary woodpile by the fifth day. They began cutting green mesquite from the creek bank, which burned poorly and required constant attention. Reed, whose cattle were in open-air corrals with board fence windbreaks that had been adequate for every previous January of his 20 years on the valley floor, lost 4 steers by the end of the 4th day to what a later veterinary account would characterize as exposure combined with stress. By day 6, he had lost 11 more. His hands worked through the night with lanterns and blankets and kept fires burning in old iron buckets placed along the corral fences, and the fires helped at the margins, but the cold was not a marginal event. By the 8th day of the freeze, the valley's losses tallied to approximately 90 head of cattle and horses, dead or so badly weakened they would not survive the spring. 3 families had moved into a single larger adobe on the valley's north end, sharing fuel and warmth, and the particular tension of too many frightened people in too few rooms. 2 children had been driven to the Bisbee physician with frostbite. One man, a bachelor homesteader named Ames, who ran a small claim 4 miles east of Griffin's Place, had walked into the fort on day 5, carrying nothing, having left his horses and his shelter behind. The valley had not seen a winter like this. Most of the older residents said so repeatedly, in the way people repeat things when the repetition is all they have to offer. Griffin, 14 miles south of all of this, was warm. Not comfortable the way a man is warm in a good house with a fire going. Warm the way the earth itself is warm, a steady and impersonal warmth that has nothing to do with fire, and everything to do with mass and insulation, and the accumulated heat of a 6-month Arizona summer stored in 14 tons of sandstone. His small cook fire, which he burned for 2 hours in the morning and 2 in the evening, raised the main chamber temperature to a sustained 53 degrees Fahrenheit across the coldest days. Without the fire, the chamber held at 44. Outside, at its worst, the air temperature reached 11 degrees on the valley floor. The differential was 33 degrees every hour of every day, without burning more than a quarter cord of wood across the full 19 days. Drum had not lost a pound. The 2 goats were producing milk without interruption. Griffin had eaten his way through his stored root vegetables and dried meat with no particular urgency, rationing out of habit rather than necessity. He had read by lantern light from a small collection of surveying and cartography texts he had acquired during his scouting years, and he had drawn in a bound paper ledger a detailed diagram of the shelter's geometry with notes on which elements had performed as expected and which he would modify if he built again. On the morning of day 8, he heard a horse on the road. He did not go out immediately. He put his coffee cup down on the flat shelf beside the lantern and listened until the sound resolved into a single rider moving at a walk, picking carefully across the ice. Then he climbed out through the dogleg passage and stood on the berm above the entrance and watched Captain Voss come down the road. Voss saw him at about 50 yards. He reined in and sat for a moment looking. Then he rode the last 50 yards slowly, the way a man rides when he is trying to decide what expression to arrive with. He stopped at the fence line. His horse was moving carefully, breath coming in steady plumes. The captain's face was red from cold, his coat frosted at the collar, and there was ice in the horse's mane from where the animal had been blowing hard earlier. Voss had been riding in 11-degree air for an hour and a half. Griffin looked at him without speaking. Voss looked at the berm, at the brush shelter above it, at the narrow vent slot on the south face. He looked at the thin line of smoke that rose from the angled chimney shaft, and at the way the frost had settled on the surrounding ground, but not on the berm itself. The earth there just slightly warmer than its surroundings, slightly darker in color. He looked at Drum, who was visible in the shadow of the brush lean-to. standing with his head low and relaxed in the easy posture of an animal that has not been cold. He climbed down from his horse. He tied the horse to the fence post. He walked to the berm and stood at the entrance of the dogleg passage and looked at Griffin. "Is it warm in there?" he said. "Come in," Griffin said. He led the way through the passage, bending at the dogleg and then upright in the main chamber. The lantern was burning. The temperature inside was 51 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough that Voss stopped moving within 2 steps of clearing the entrance, the way a man stops when he walks out of the cold and into somewhere that has no right to be what it is. Voss stood still. He pulled off one glove and held his bare hand out in front of him, not touching anything, just feeling the air. His hand was red from cold, and in the lantern light the color was slow to drain from it. He bent and put his palm flat on the back wall, on the face of one of the stored heat stones, and held it there for a moment. He straightened up. He looked at Griffin for a long time, and something moved in his face that was too complicated to name simply. Part professional recognition, and part something older and harder to carry. "I did not believe," Voss said, and then stopped. He started again. "I did not credit it." Griffin said nothing. Voss looked at the dry stacked walls, at the angled entrance passage, at the flat stones along the back, at the low connecting passage where Drum's head was just visible in the warm shadow. He looked at the ledger on the shelf beside the lantern. He looked at the diagram visible on the open page, and the shelter's geometry set down in Griffin's plain, precise hand. "How many days can you hold this?" he said. "As many as it freezes," Griffin said. Voss put his glove back on slowly. He looked at the stone floor, and then at Griffin. "How much livestock have you lost?" he said. "None," Griffin said. Voss nodded once, very slightly, the smallest acknowledgement a man can make when the acknowledgement costs him something. He stayed for perhaps 20 minutes. He did not ask for an explanation of the design, not yet, though his eyes moved over every element of it with the attention of a man who intends to remember. When he climbed back out through the passage into the 11-degree air, he stood for a moment with his face tilted to the gray sky, and the cold hit him again, in the abrupt way it hits a person who has just been somewhere warm. He untied his horse and mounted. "I'll come back," he said. "When this lifts." Griffin looked at him from the berm. "The valley has been losing stock since the 4th, he said. It was the longest thing he had said in the entire visit, and he said it without emphasis, the way a man reports what he has observed. Voss looked at him once more, and this time the thing in his face was simply the look of a man who has been wrong for a long time and has just run out of the means to avoid it. He turned his horse and rode north. The freeze held for 11 more days. By its end, the full count of livestock lost across the valley had reached approximately 340 head of cattle, horses, and goats, a number that represented a meaningful fraction of the valley's total productive animal capital for that year. 4 families sustained structural damage to their adobe homes, 2 of them serious enough to require rebuilding before spring. Ames never returned to his claim east of Griffin's place. Reed survived the freeze with 31 animals remaining from a herd that had numbered 60 before January, and he spent March and most of April trying to account for whether his operation was still viable. Griffin's Silvermane, on 60 acres of dry creek bottomland that no one had wanted, had lost nothing. Voss returned on the 27th of January, as he had said he would, with his horse and a saddlebag containing a bound government ledger and several sheets of good paper for drawing. He sat in the main chamber for 3 hours, while Griffin walked him through every element of the design, beginning with the rock shelf foundation and the dry stone wall method, and ending with the angle of the windbreak berm and the reason for the dogleg entrance passage. Voss asked careful questions and wrote careful answers, and made 3 separate detailed drawings of the shelter's components, his handwriting small and precise, the kind of record a man makes when he intends it to be used. He did not apologize in the way that word is usually understood. What he did was ask, near the end of the 3 hours, whether Griffin would object to having the design documented in the fort's engineering annex records, attributed to its builder, under a notation that cited its Apache thermal principles. Griffin said he did not object. That was the closest the conversation came to what had happened between them in the spring of 1890. The documentation circulated through the fort by March of 1892 and reached the desk of the Army's district quartermaster in Tucson by April. The design was described in Voss's notes as a low-profile earth berm thermal shelter utilizing Apache construction principles, suitable for livestock and supply storage in territorial freeze conditions. It was not called the Apache rabbit hole. It was not called anything derisive. It was called, in a subsequent letter from the quartermaster's office, a practical shelter design for the Arizona climate, and 3 ranchers in the valley had begun building their own versions before summer arrived. Pruitt had ridden out to Griffin's place in the last week of January, before the fort's documentation was complete and before the valley had fully reckoned with its losses. He came, as Voss had come, alone and without announcement. Griffin was on the berm repairing a section of the brush overhang when Pruitt rode up, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Pruitt had the look of a man who has prepared something and found, on arrival, that the thing he prepared will not serve. He cleared his throat. He looked at the berm and at the vent slot and at Drum standing quiet in the lean-to. "I'll allow that I was wrong," he said. He said it the way a man drives a nail he doesn't want to drive, fully and without flourish, because there is no other way to finish the job. Griffin looked at him from the berm. "All right," he said. Pruitt glanced at Drum, who was watching them both with the calm, assessing gaze of an animal that has outlasted several events. "None lost," he said. "None," Griffin said. Pruitt sat on his horse for another moment, and then he turned and rode back up the road toward the fort. And the third and last time the label was spoken in the valley, it was spoken by Pruitt himself in the Benson trading post, 2 weeks later, to a group of men who had gathered to hear what he had seen at the Silvermane place. He said, "I called it the Apache rabbit hole, and I was a damn fool to do it." And the room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the man who made the joke is the one retracting it, which is the only kind of retraction that carries any weight. The label did not disappear from the valley's memory overnight. Labels never do. What happened was slower and in some ways more complete. The thing the label had tried to dismiss became the thing people referred to when they discussed building for the next winter. And once a method becomes useful, it tends to outlive its original name. By the summer of 1892, men in the valley were calling it the berm shelter design, or sometimes just the hillside shelter. And when they said it without the slight downward inflection that had accompanied the old name. Lena came back in May of that year on the same rented buckboard, and Griffin showed her the valley below from the high berm on a warm afternoon when the creosote was in pale yellow bloom and the creek was running with snowmelt from the eastern mountains. He showed her the diagram in the ledger and the notation in Voss's documentation and the letter from the Tucson quartermaster's office, though he showed her these things not to prove something, but in the way that a person shares something quietly when they want a witness they trust. She read the notation in Voss's ledger and set it back on the shelf and looked at her brother. "What about the Army?" she said. "That is a separate account," he said. She nodded. She did not press it further. And it wasn't pressed further because both of them understood that some accounts resolve in documentation and some resolve in other ways, and the two resolutions do not always arrive at the same time. What Griffin had was the valley's acknowledgement and the work itself, and those were the two things he had set out for. The berm shelter method spread through the San Pedro Valley in the years that followed with the steady, unspectacular momentum of a thing that works. By 1895, 11 homesteads on the lower valley had built some version of Griffin's design, most of them adapted for their specific terrain but holding the essential principles: the south-facing hillside placement, the dry stone walls, the dogleg entry, the stored heat mass along the north wall, the windbreak berm above. None of them failed in the two subsequent cold winters of 1895 and 1898. Several of them outlasted their builders and were still in use by families who had acquired the claims in later years and who used the shelters because they worked rather than because they knew where the design had come from. Voss left Fort Huachuca in 1896 on a transfer to a post in New Mexico Territory. Before he left, he added a single addendum to his original documentation in the fort's engineering annex, noting that the design had been observed in use across the San Pedro Valley for 5 years, without structural failure in freeze conditions, and recommending its consideration for any future territorial construction planning in similar climates. He did not send Griffin a copy of the addendum, but the fort's records were available to anyone who inquired, and Griffin never inquired because he had not built for the record. By 1910, Griffin's Silvermane had been on his 60 acres for 19 years. The dry creek bottomland that the valley had looked at with skepticism in 1891 was now a productive small holding of goats, a kitchen garden, and a modest horse-breeding operation focused on the desert-hardy stock that did well at altitude. He had sold 10 horses in the past 2 years, each one trained to a standard that brought buyers from as far as Tucson. He had added a second berm shelter cellar for storage in 1899, built to the same principles as the first and performing as the first had performed. The main chamber was the same as it had been in January of 1892. The dry stacked walls had not shifted. The stored heat stones along the back wall had been replenished twice over the years, as some of the originals cracked, but the principle they embodied had not changed. The dogleg entrance passage was worn smooth at the turn by 19 years of hands trailing the wall in the dark. On a morning in late March of 1910, Griffin came out of the main chamber into a pale early sun and stood on the berm with a cup of coffee and looked at the valley below. The San Pedro River was running high with spring snowmelt, the same as it had run every spring since he had arrived, and the creosote on the lower slopes was carrying its first pale green growth of the season. The color so faint it looked like something the light was inventing rather than something that was actually there. Drum was on the upper slope behind the shelter. He was 26 years old, which was old for a horse, and he moved with the slow deliberateness of an animal that has learned the particular economy of effort that comes with long years. His coat had faded from gray roan to a near white in the places the sun hit it, and there was a slight stiffness in his left rear that showed in the way he placed his feet. He was grazing the dry winter grass along the rock shelf where the sun had warmed the ground first, which was the same spot he had grazed every morning for 19 years. As though he had arrived at it by opinion rather than habit, Griffin watched the horse for a while. The coffee in his cup was still warm. Below, in the valley, the first smoke of morning was beginning to rise from the chimneys of the valley's homesteads, thin and pale against the pale sky, the ordinary visible sign of people at their morning work. Most of the shelters on those homesteads had berm-protected woodpiles. Several had cellar chambers of one design or another. The valley had learned, as valleys do, slowly and at cost, and what it carried forward from the learning was the practical thing, the thing that had worked with no more ceremony than that. The wind off the northwest ridge was light and cold, the particular early morning cold of the high desert that burns off by 9 o'clock and leaves the day clear. It moved through the creosote with a sound like water, and Drum raised his head briefly to face it, then went back to his grass. What a man knows is only useful when the weather finally agrees to test it. Drum grazed on in the warm light. The coffee was finished. The valley was already at its work,